Section number 6 of A Hypocritical Romance and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Hypocritical Romance and Other Stories by Carolyn Ticknor. The Evolution of a Bonnet. Miss Elizabeth Moore was quite a philosopher in her own way, though no one would have been more astonished than she to have been told so. In fact, I doubt if her ideas about philosophers were at all distinct. Had you insisted upon a definition, she would have told you that Thornbridge, being a busy place, had no use for a class of individuals who talked instead of working, and who spent their time in thinking about things instead of buckling down and doing them. Thornbridge was a town in which the spirit of work reigned supreme, and the thrifty inhabitants had very few idle moments in which to grow unhappy or discontented. They lived in an ideal and Arcadian atmosphere, which was as yet unspoiled by any current from the great sea of manufacturing interests. The beauty of the country was, however, beginning to attract a rapidly increasing summer population to the picturesque old town, who, with their fancy cottages and wonderful equipages, filled the sturdy inhabitants with a kind of awe, which soon gave way to a hearty dislike, as the invaders increased in numbers, and, without saying by your leave, proceeded to erect casinos and bowling alleys, and numberless other things for their own benefit, into which the worthy natives received no invitation to enter. Moreover, the knowledge of the fact that the land obtained from the honest farmers for a mere song was sold again to others for 5 and 6 times the original amount aroused their righteous indignation, which was not lessened by the visitations of cruel and sweetly smiling ladies, who, on some pretense or other, found their way into the neat cottages and farmhouses, and who, by virtue of a few fair words and a surprisingly few silver coins, carried off old clocks, old spinning wheels, and old china from the simple farmers' wives and daughters, to whom a little ready money seemed so much more precious than the few household treasures which they gave in return. The substantial old farmhouse occupied by Miss Elizabeth Moore and her niece, Delight, was on the very outskirts of the village, and stood alone upon a little breezy promontory commanding a charming view of the village below. The house and several acres of land had been Elizabeth's share of old Farmer Moore's property after his death, and in vain had been the offers of the relentless summer boarders who would have liked to build upon this desirable spot. Miss Elizabeth was firm on these occasions, though firmness was by no means one of her ruling characteristics. She was, as her niece Delight often said, much too impulsive, and had not her niece been on hand to see that she remained unfaltering in her resolutions at some such time, it is just possible that Miss Elizabeth might, dazzled by the offer of so much money, have sold the house and land, and realized what seemed to her an enormous fortune by the transaction. At the time of which I speak it was a perfect summer evening, with just the faintest breeze rustling through the honeysuckles on the porch. Miss Elizabeth sat stiffly in her high-backed rocker, with her knitting in her hands, and her busy needles clicked, regardless of the fast-settling darkness, for she always thought with scorn of those who had to look on to knit. Delight, quite unconscious of the graceful picture she made, was seated upon the upper step, with her head resting against one of the posts, about which the honeysuckle twined, forming a leafy background with its swaying tendrils and tassels, and contrasting charmingly with the wavy brown locks, which remained unruffled by the breeze. Her fine dark eyes were fixed with an intensely thoughtful expression upon a distant hill, and her hands were clasped in her lap with a firmness which denoted a mind bent upon solving some important problem. "No, Aunt Lizzie," she was saying, "we cannot spare 1 cent to spend on a bonnet for me. You know that the eggs did not bring in what we expected, and it will take the last of my school money to pay for the flour on Saturday." "Sakes alive!" exclaimed Miss Elizabeth. "I guess that man can afford to wait a while for his money. His daughter's not in need of a bonnet, judging by what I saw of combined tail feathers and flower gardens on her head last Sunday. And as for ribbons, why, she must have bought the stores out. You must get you one with that kind of a high crown, Delight," she added. "Perhaps I may, but after the term is over," replied her niece, in a decided tone, which did not prevent Miss Elizabeth from entering a final protest. "The term over, indeed!" she exclaimed, indignantly, "and the longest terms and the smallest pay. I declare it makes me provoked to think of your teaching those aggravating little boys day in and day out for an independence, and then not getting yourself a bonnet even. It was only Tuesday week when Deacon Jones told me that there wasn't a girl in the village with your ability. That's what he said. And everybody with eyes knows that there's not one that can hold a candle to you in looks, if you're not so stout and robust as Matilda Robinson. If it wasn't for the opening of the fair I wouldn't feel so bad. But to see all the fine summer people in that old faded white thing, with the ribbon worse than none, why, I've thought about how I can fix it up very nicely, Aunt Lizzie," interrupted the girl. "And, after all, what's a bonnet? A bonnet is not everything." "What's a bonnet?" repeated Miss Elizabeth. "A bonnet is everything. Don't interrupt me. I haven't lived in Thornbridge almost half a century to have my experience go for nothing. A first-class, stylish bonnet or hat on a woman's head is the next best thing to a crown of glory. No man ever yet realized the importance of a bonnet. A man wears a hat to keep his head warm or cool, or to shade his eyes, and he hasn't intelligence enough to know that a woman does not do the same. What sensible woman ever bought a bonnet just because it was warm, or cool, or shady? What she wants is to have it become her. And if she is once satisfied that it really does, she'll find, and her friends'll find, that she will wear that bonnet, and that heat and cold, or light and shade, aren't the consideration. And so," concluded Miss Elizabeth, after pausing for breath, "you just remember that the bonnet is first as well as topmost. Get on a first-class bonnet, and whether you are in Thornbridge, or sailing up the Isle of St. Peter's in Rome, you can look the whole world in the face and wear just whatever kind of dress you like." Delight listened with great enjoyment to her aunt's earnest discourse, but all Miss Elizabeth's eloquence failed to alter her niece's determination, and the following morning saw her depart for school, taking with her the necessary money to pay for their last barrel of flour. "And nothing left for bonnets," mused her aunt, in a tone of resignation, as she watched Delight's trim figure disappear down the road, wearing the neat but well-worn black gown, which had been made over and turned until even Delight's ingenuity had reached its limit. After finishing the morning's work, which Miss Elizabeth never allowed to be a long process, she put on her sunbonnet, and, trowel in hand, stepped out into the garden to spend an hour among her flowers, for the garden was her chief pride and joy. She had gone only a few steps when she became aware that a light wagonette was stopping at the gate, and a handsome, athletic young fellow, who had reined up a pair of spirited greys, jumped lightly to the ground, and helped two elegantly dressed ladies to alight. He remained, inspecting the horses, while they advanced up the path toward Miss Elizabeth, who at once put them down on the list of would-be purchasers of her land, and prepared to meet them with a dignity and firmness which should do credit to Delight's admonitions. So she held her trowel still in hand, and bowed stiffly from the depths of her sunbonnet in return to their cordial salutation. Young Mrs. Boylston, the elder of the two visitors, did most of the talking. "This is Miss Moore, I believe," she began, condescendingly. "At least they told me at the post office that Miss Moore lived here." "Yes, I am Miss Moore," responded Miss Elizabeth, shortly. "You certainly have a most charming view here, and the location is perfect. I suppose the view of the village is even prettier from the piazza," Mrs. Boylston suggested. Miss Elizabeth remained immovably in the path. "Yes," she said, dryly, "it is somewhat, but," she added briefly, "it's no use for you to look at it, for the place is not for sale, not 1 square inch of it." The ladies seemed much amused at this, and Mrs. Boylston hastened to explain that they did not care to buy any land. "I have all the land I can manage now, Miss Moore, and my sister and I are merely driving about the country to find from which of the high points the view is prettiest. And," she added, sweetly, "we thought that perhaps you would ask us up on your fine breezy piazza for a moment." Miss Elizabeth thawed at once, and endeavored to atone for her previous incivility by bringing the most comfortable chairs for them to rest upon, and begging that they would make themselves at home and stay as long as they chose. "I would ask you in," she added, "but I know it's nicer out here in the breeze. We should like to take a peep at your house, if you're willing," both the ladies exclaimed, and Miss Elizabeth led the way into the cozy sitting room, which they inspected with apparent interest. "I see you have one of those old clocks, Miss Moore," remarked the younger lady, advancing towards the tall timepiece in the corner. "I don't suppose you care much for an old clock like this. I would rather like to take one back to remember Thornbridge by. Don't you want to sell it to me?" Miss Elizabeth bridled up at once. "No, I don't think of putting up my things at auction just yet, and as for relics, you will have to look for them somewhere else. Moreover, a clock that's in first-class condition and keeps the best of time is not much of a relic to my mind, if it is old." The visitors, beginning to realize that they would hardly reap the desired harvest here, prepared to withdraw, after thanking Miss Moore for her kindness. Mrs. Boylston, however, her eyes rested lovingly upon the heavy brass candlesticks, determined to make one final effort in that direction. "I wish I knew where I could buy some candlesticks," she exclaimed. "We have such trouble getting our rooms lighted up here, where there is no gas. I don't care for very nice ones. Almost anything would do, such as those, for instance," pointing to the ones on the mantel. "Of course I know that you would not part with those," she hastily added, seeing Miss Moore preparing to bridle. "But if you could tell me where to go." As she spoke, Mrs. Boylston glanced into the mirror over the fireplace and straightened her bonnet, and at that moment Miss Elizabeth's mood changed like a flash. She would sell the old brass candlesticks. She did not care for them, and she didn't believe Delight did, and there would be some money for the new bonnet. She surprised the ladies by remarking, "Well, I don't know as I care so much for the candlesticks, but it is quite against my principles to sell things. Still, just to oblige you, I might be willing to part with them." Mrs. Boylston's eyes brightened with pleasure, but she only said, in a careless tone, "It would save me a good deal of trouble if you will let me have them. I will give you 50 cents for the pair." "Very well, you may have them," said Miss Elizabeth, stiffly, already regretting that she had not shown them the door instead of humiliating herself to this extent. She had thought that the candlesticks would be worth more, but she was no judge of their value, and 50 cents would hardly buy Delight the sort of new bonnet she desired. She stepped into the china closet to get a piece of paper in which to wrap up the candlesticks, when, looking around, she saw that her visitors had followed, and were remarking that her old blue china just matched some that they had. Wouldn't she sell those 2 platters and the blue and white bowl? She would give $1 for each platter and 50 cents for the bowl. Miss Elizabeth prepared to be indignant and to reject this offer with scorn, but instead, how she happened to do so she could not have told, except that the idea of that bonnet obliterated all others. She found herself in possession of 3 crisp dollar bills, and through the window she caught sight of the handsome young man stowing something under the seat, while the ladies talked and laughed in an animated way that grated terribly upon her ears. Somehow she could not seem to settle down again to her work. She took up the trowel and tried gardening, but only for a few moments. Then she came indoors again, and sat down in her high-backed chair and rocked. Sat there absolutely idle, if one whose thoughts are so active can be termed idle. And the more she thought, the more she became convinced that Delight would not be pleased with the transaction. Then she decided not to tell her where the money had come from until some time after the bonnet had been purchased. Delight came home that afternoon in unusual spirits, and Miss Elizabeth watched at the doorway with pride and satisfaction as she approached with glowing cheeks and parted lips, which disclosed 2 rows of the whitest little teeth. "Visitors at school today, Aunt Lizzie," she began, seating herself upon the steps, "and such interesting ones, too. None of your old fogies who insist upon making the boys recite something that they don't know." "Tell me all about it, dearie," said her aunt, settling down with her knitting, and beginning to wonder how she should ever bring in the money for the bonnet successfully. "Well, you see, auntie, they arrived just a few minutes before recess, with dear old Judge Felton, who always has been so kind to me, 2 beautifully dressed ladies, and oh, such a very handsome young man." The judge introduced them as Mrs. Boylston, her sister, Miss Hollis, and her brother-in-law, Mr. Harold Boylston. Judge Felton made some embarrassing remarks about my being his pet school marm, and I realized how very shabby my old black dress looked. But they were most agreeable, and stayed and talked to me all through recess, after which they drove off in a very stylish wagonette. Mr. Boylston seemed very much interested in my method of teaching the boys, and said he should like to come up again some day, if I was willing. "How very nice of him," remarked Miss Elizabeth, dryly. "Yes," continued her niece, "and the Boylstons are the people who have built that lovely new house at the other end of the village, where we saw the tennis courts being marked out." Miss Elizabeth did not broach the bonnet question that evening, but decided to wait until a more favorable moment arrived. The following afternoon she sat down with her knitting to await her niece's return, and she had just begun to wonder if Delight were not later than usual, when she heard voices, and one of them was distinctly masculine. As they reached the gate, she recognized the same young man who had driven the spirited grays, and he carried her niece's books with the same careless ease that had characterized his management of the horses. He lifted his hat and departed, and Delight smilingly approached her aunt. "That was Mr. Boylston," she remarked. "He is evidently very much interested in your method of teaching," Miss Elizabeth said, a little impatiently. "Yes, he really is very much interested in the school work, and he says that he thinks of teaching for a couple of terms, just for the practice, now that he has finished college." "Oh," said her aunt, doubtfully. Then she continued, "Do you realize that it is only 3 days before the fair, and you haven't done a thing about that bonnet?" "So it is," replied Delight, gravely, preparing to concentrate her whole mind upon this vital subject. "But I had a bright idea to-day while the boys were doing mental arithmetic, and I'm sure you'll think my new bonnet a success when you see it, and not a cent of expense, either. No, dear, you are to have a brand new, stylish bonnet, and it shall cost something. And here is the money for it," she added, drawing the 3 bills triumphantly out of her pocket. "Why, Aunt Lizzie, where did that come from?" cried her niece, in surprise. "Never mind, the fairies are around sometimes, and why not here as well as elsewhere?" But no, Delight would not be satisfied. She would not use the money till she knew where it came from, and little by little she drew the truth from her unwilling aunt. And then it was that Miss Elizabeth began to realize what a very dreadful thing she had done. How could she for an instant suppose that Delight would use a cent of such money? How could she have tolerated even the slightest suggestion of such a transaction? Hadn't she a particle of pride left? Oh, it was too humiliating, and Delight burst into tears. Miss Elizabeth was in the depths of despair. She had thought that she was doing it for the best, but she saw now that it was a great mistake. She would send the money back, however, take it back herself, if necessary. Anything, if Delight would only not feel so badly. Here her niece's indignation against Mrs. Boylston broke forth. To think of entering people's houses on false pretenses, for the purpose of cheating them out of a few things which they did not know the value of. $3, indeed! And that young Mr. Boylston was with them at the time, and then he dared to walk home with me after that, up to the very gate, interested in school teaching. I presume he wishes to have as much fun out of the natives in this way as his sister-in-law does in hers. But he will find that his amusement has ceased where I am concerned. There was to be no school on the following day, but Delight came down earlier than usual, and Miss Elizabeth timidly watched her determined expression and decided step as she moved about the house, seemingly unconscious of her aunt's strenuous efforts to atone for her unpardonable offense by preparing as many of her favorite dishes as possible. Delight, however, exhibited but very little appetite for breakfast, but noticing the expression of deep gloom settling over her aunt's face when she had twice refused to taste the delicately browned waffles, she impulsively threw her arms about Miss Elizabeth's neck, and, kissing her, exclaimed, "Don't you worry a bit about anything, Auntie. I am the most ungrateful girl living, and you are the sweetest and most unselfish creature in the whole world. I will make things all right, and you shall see me in a bonnet which you shall be proud of." The breakfast dishes cleared away. Delight set to work at once upon the old and well-worn bonnet. It was a light straw, trimmed with buff ribbons, which had long since faded into a doubtful white. The straw was still in very good condition, although the shape was sadly out of style. Miss Elizabeth eyed it mournfully, but Delight set to work with an amount of assurance which could not but inspire the most skeptical with confidence. She soaked the old straw thoroughly in water, and then, taking possession of the brown bread mold, shaped the crown skillfully over its top, and, after bending the brim of the bonnet up at just the proper angle, fastened it firmly in place by winding string about it and left it to dry. "That shape will be just the latest agony," she announced to Miss Elizabeth. "And now for my ribbon. I'm going to dye it cardinal." She produced a small package of red powder, and, after dissolving it in water, plunged in all the faded buff ribbon, which came forth a beautiful shade of dark red, and, when it was ironed out, even Miss Elizabeth acknowledged that it could hardly have been told from new. "Though it is perhaps a trifle stiff," she added. "Do you suppose that those old pink roses would take the color too?" questioned Delight a moment later, to which her aunt replied, "We can see," and brought them down forthwith. Delight let them sink deep into the red liquid, and then drew them carefully out, and hung them to dry near the stove. They really looked remarkably well. By this time the straw was dry and pressed firmly into shape, and it now only remained to be trimmed. Here Delight showed herself mistress of her art, for her bows never flopped down when they should have stood up, nor stuck out where they should have gone in, and she caught up the red roses on one side in just the most becoming way, showing enough to let you know that they were red roses, and yet not too much, to thrust upon your consciousness the fact that they were not perhaps the most perfect kind of roses. At last it was finished, and the successful artist tied the bow under her chin, and stood before the old-fashioned mirror inspecting her morning's work. "It is perfectly lovely," Miss Elizabeth declared, with enthusiasm, "and I should think it had come straight from Paris." After dinner Delight arrayed herself in her best gown. It was a pale gray cashmere, and perfectly simple, but it fitted her graceful figure without a wrinkle. And then, after adjusting the new bonnet, which still filled her aunt with awe and admiration, she drew on her silk gloves, and prepared to start out. Miss Elizabeth did not dare to ask any questions with regard to her mission, but she did venture to call after her in a frightened tone, "Don't do anything that you may be sorry for, Delight." "No, Aunt Lizzie," she returned, in a calm voice, as she moved slowly down the walk, stopping only long enough to put one dark red rose into her buttonhole. A little later in the afternoon Mrs. Boylston was languidly reclining in a hammock on the airy upper veranda which overlooked the wide lawn, where her sister and young Mr. Boylston had been engaged in a game of tennis, for which, however, they seemed to feel very little enthusiasm, as they had returned to the upper piazza. Miss Hollis had dropped into a steamer chair, and young Boylston was sitting upon the balustrade, deeply intent upon trying to balance his racket upon one finger. At this moment a servant appeared, bringing word that Miss Moore would like to see Mrs. Boylston. "Miss Moore?" queried the lady. "Who can she be?" "Well, ask her to come up here." "Why, she must be the woman who sold me the candlesticks and those fascinating platters," she continued. "I saw a platter like them in town not long ago, and the man at the shop asked me $7 for it, and I got mine for $1 apiece, Harold." "By George!" exclaimed her brother-in-law, jumping up, "cheating country people out of their few household gods. To my mind, it's the smallest kind of swindling when the rich cheat the poor, and I shouldn't think you would be over proud of the transaction." The conversation was suddenly arrested by the arrival of Miss Moore upon the scene. It was a trying ordeal for her, but she boldly faced the enemy's guns, and, with sparkling eyes and head erect, advanced without flinching. Both the ladies rose, and greeted her with a cool friendliness which hardly disguised their evident surprise at receiving a call from the pretty school mistress. Harold Boylston's pleasure was quite evident, and he brought forth a large armchair, saying, "Won't you sit here, Miss Moore?" But Delight remained standing. "I wish to see you only for a moment, Mrs. Boylston," she began, in a clear voice, "to return some money which my aunt received from you the other day. We are not in the habit of parting with our household possessions, which we value rather for their family associations than for their actual worth, which you doubtless appreciate better than we." Mrs. Boylston winced. "Pray accept the platters and the candlesticks," she continued, "if they please you, as it is a great pleasure for simple country people like ourselves to contribute in any way toward the happiness or amusement." Here her eyes rested coldly upon Harold. "Of those who, like yourself, can so easily gratify every wish. We are only too glad to give them to you, Mrs. Boylston. Good afternoon." And, thrusting the $3 into that offended lady's hand, Miss Moore swept from the piazza with the scornful air of a princess. "Isn't she just superb?" exclaimed young Boylston, warmly. "She crushed you completely, Nellie, and to think of an ignorant country girl like that daring to confront me with such impudence," cried Mrs. Boylston, angrily. "You didn't get half you deserved," rejoined Harold, swinging himself over the railing, with asperity. "I wish she had told you what she really thought of you. If that is your idea of an ignorant country girl, it's not mine. And as for style, why, there was an atmosphere about that bonnet which few of your New Yorkers could rival. I'm off for a constitutional, ladies, so you can fight it out between you." As he disappeared across the lawn, Mrs. Boylston sank back into her hammock with a sigh. "I do so hate scenes," she murmured, "and Harold of late seems to take pleasure in saying unkind, cutting things to me. I'm sure I have never objected to his flirting with any number of country girls, and I don't know why he should be so ugly about a few old candlesticks." But I shall have those things sent right back this very evening. After that girl's absurd conduct, I would not have them in the house another night." Meanwhile Delight was walking briskly along the shady lane. She felt that she had passed through the trying ordeal with success. Perhaps her display of pride and spirit had made her appear ridiculous, and even now they were probably laughing at her, but she did not care. They might laugh on the surface, but they knew down in their hearts that she had had the best of the encounter. And Mr. Boylston had really looked quite as if he thought so, too. How becoming a tennis suit was to him! Just at this point she arrived at the crossroads, where, much to her amazement, she encountered that very individual turning the corner with a calm and unruffled demeanor, which told no tales of his brisk run across the fields. Delight, however, resented his assured air, and showed none of the surprise which she felt at his sudden appearance, but regarded him with perfect indifference. "Are you provoked with me, too?" he inquired, in an injured tone. "I declare, I am so afraid of you that the power of speech has quite deserted me after the magnificent way in which you sailed into Mrs. Boylston just now. I'm not sure that you will have anything to say to me, though I can't see why I am responsible for people who are only my connections by marriage. Please may I walk home with you, Miss Moore?" Delight, who had determined upon her course of action, replied ironically that she was glad to see that fright had not robbed him of the use of his legs as well as of his tongue, but that it would be quite unnecessary for him to go any farther in that direction. "I am glad of that," he responded, gaily. "I hate to do necessary things, and I know you do, only you won't acknowledge it. When I walk with a pretty girl, I do it not because it is necessary, but because it is agreeable." "Agreeable to whom?" interrupted Delight. "To both of us," replied Boylston, looking into her eyes with one of his most irresistible glances. "Speak for yourself," replied his companion, coolly. "That's a very dangerous remark to make to any impetuous young fellow," responded he, meditatively. "It played the dickens with poor John Eldon, you know, and left Miles Standish disconsolate." "It is certainly a rather superfluous remark to make to you, Mr. Boylston," said Delight, who found it most difficult to remain stern and unbending. Boylston decided to try a different tack, so he stopped suddenly, and lifting his hat said, gravely, "If my company is really distasteful to you, Miss Moore, I will not thrust it upon you any longer, but will bid you good afternoon." "Good afternoon," responded Delight, sweetly, continuing to walk rapidly away from him, and without a glance in his direction. This was not satisfactory, however, and Harold Boylston started at once after the departing figure. "On second thoughts," he said, reaching her side, "I think I won't say good afternoon just yet." "Second thoughts are not always the best," replied Delight, greeting his sudden reappearance with perfect indifference. "I don't care about their being so always. It is enough satisfaction to have them best just now," said Boylston, who saw with much pleasure that a reassuring twinkle was beginning to manifest itself in his companion's eyes. "It is no use," she laughed. "I really can't be provoked with you. You're so absurd." "I don't know why you should be provoked with me," Boylston protested, with an air of injured innocence. "I haven't done anything worse than to tell my sister-in-law what I thought of her little bric-a-brac transactions, in not the most complimentary terms, either. Why didn't your aunt snub her, as she deserved, on the spot? I do not see how she came to let my worthy connections indulge in their favorite pastime. I'm afraid she has not your spirit. I wish you had been there to give them a piece of your mind." There was such an unmistakable ring of sincerity in his voice that Delight could not but relent, and then, as Aunt Elizabeth must be vindicated, she told him all about the bonnet. "It is a perfect stunner," cried Boylston, enthusiastically, regarding her with undisguised admiration. "Only my fingers are rather pink, still," said Delight, drawing off one of her silk gloves and eyeing her fingertips ruefully. "But," she continued, "I was very cross to Aunt Elizabeth when I came home and found out what she had done. I was just horrid." but you can't think how humiliated I felt." "Yes, I can," broke in Boylston, warmly. "I know just how you felt. You hated us all, and knew that I was just as bad as the rest, only worse." "Yes," assented Delight, frankly. "I thought a great many unpleasant things about you, and said that I did not care to amuse the summer residents in company with old clocks and candlesticks. I'll renounce my claims to being a summer resident and become a native, if you'll only restore me to favor and be friends," he protested. By the time Miss Moore's gate had been reached, this request had evidently been granted, and Miss Elizabeth, who had been anxiously awaiting her niece's return, was much astonished to see her come back quite on the best of terms with that very same not-to-be-tolerated young man. She showed no surprise, however, when Delight introduced Mr. Boylston, but invited him to come in and rest a while after his walk, which he did without waiting for further urging, and spent a good long hour. His last words before taking leave were, "I shall be on the lookout for that lovely red bonnet at the fair tomorrow." When he had gone, Miss Elizabeth listened with great interest to the afternoon's proceedings. At the end of the recital she drew a long sigh of relief. "But it doesn't seem as though you snubbed the young man much," she finally remarked. "I tried my best, Aunt Lizzie, but he wouldn't be snubbed," said Delight, thoughtfully. That night Mrs. Boylston's man brought up a bundle addressed to Miss Moore, which, when opened, was found to contain 2 platters, a blue and white bowl, and a pair of brass candlesticks. Harold Boylston had promised to escort the ladies to the agricultural fair, and they insisted upon his being in constant attendance upon them, and upon his telling them all about the horses, the cows, and the sheep. Miss Hollis made him ask first how many inches the prize squash measured, and then how much the largest bunch of grapes weighed, while Mrs. Boylston sent him to inquire if she could buy any of the prize apples afterwards, until his much-tried patience quite gave way, for, in the distance, he saw Delight's red bonnet, now pausing beside the fancy sheep, while he must needs examine squashes, and then inspecting the prize bantams, while his sister-in-law dragged him over to look at a kind of lawn-mower that would roll the grass in the most approved style. Moreover, his interest in lawn-mowers was not increased by his knowledge of the fact that his own classmate, Charlie Felton, who had proved to be old Judge Felton's nephew, was by Delight's side, and acted as though he expected to remain there for the rest of the day. He suddenly slipped away, just as Mrs. Boylston was looking at the Plymouth Rock hens, and hastened towards the fascinating red bonnet. Delight seemed very glad to see him, and Felton greeted him with evident surprise. "Why, where did you come from, Boylston?" "I'm so glad to see you, Charlie. And my sister and Miss Hollis are dying to speak to you. Don't you see them over there? I'll take care of Miss Moore while you run over and say how d'ye do." "I should be charmed to see them again, of course," exclaimed Felton, whose countenance, however, failed to express the greatest pleasure at the immediate prospect. "But I have promised to show Miss Moore some of my uncle's prize apples first, so I'll see you a little later." And Felton prepared to move on. His friend was not to be thus easily baffled. "I'm going to show Miss Moore the giant turnips," he persisted, "while you just speak to my sister. See, she is waving her parasol now." There was nothing for Felton to do but to go, and his friend smiled with satisfaction at his reluctant departure. "Suppose we walk down to the end of the grove, where there isn't such a crowd, and where we can cool off," he suggested. "But you were going to take me to see the giant turnips," protested Delight. "And, besides, if we go off there, Mr. Felton will never find us." "I don't intend that he shall," was Boylston's mental comment, but he only said, "Oh, I don't think he will have any difficulty. You don't suppose that I really wanted to show you giant turnips, do you? I hate such things. It is bad enough for such unpalatable substances as turnips to exist without their having the effrontery to grow to any such unwieldy size." "I was only trying to offset Felton's apples. But if you're so interested in those monstrosities, we will go up into that hot place and look at them." As Delight expressed no great desire to do so, they strolled down through the grove which led out of the grounds, and Boylston espied an inviting rustic bench, on which they might rest in the shade of the tall pines. Felton, meanwhile, had been cordially welcomed by Mrs. Boylston and her sister, who at once appropriated him in a manner he hardly relished. Harold had disappeared, and he saw no means of escape, so he asked the ladies to come up and look at the prize turnips, where he hoped to encounter that deceitful individual. Harold, however, was not in the vicinity of the turnips. About this time, Mrs. Boylston casually remarked, "I wonder what has become of Harold," and Felton at once rose to the emergency. "He is probably having hard work to find us in this crowd. Now, if you ladies will take a seat on that bench, I will look him up." "Oh, no matter, Mr. Felton," they exclaimed, reassuringly. "Don't trouble yourself about him." They were both more than satisfied with his society. "It is no trouble at all," he hastened to assure them. "I will find him in just one moment," and he dashed off into the yard. "What a handsome fellow he is," commented Mrs. Boylston, "and so very obliging and energetic. Now Harold is so lazy." "He is too obliging," Miss Hollis rejoined. "He need not have been so anxious to find Harold. It was just an excuse to get away. I don't see why you wanted to see Harold, when we have had so much of his society, and I'm sure he was grumpy enough when I asked him about those ugly little pigs with their tails all out of curl. You see if Mr. Felton comes back with Harold, that's all. What uncomfortable seats these are. I wish the man who made them had to sit in them for the rest of his life." "There wouldn't be much rest of his life if he did," replied her sister. "Don't," faintly murmured Miss Hollis. "How can you joke in this hot, wretched place?" During this time, Felton, who had reached the yard, was pausing a moment to think. "I might have known Boylston would skip off and leave me for the rest of the day, but I'll get even with him on the monopolizing business. He is probably down in the grove." So saying, Felton hastened in that direction, and was soon rewarded by a glimpse of the most attractive red bonnet not far away. "Now I call this true enjoyment," Boylston was just saying. "This is my first experience of agricultural fairs, and I think they are the best fun in the world." At this point a most unwelcome voice interrupted. "So this is the way you show Miss Moore prize turnips, is it? Boylston, you are a man of excellent taste." "That's why I let the turnips alone," responded Harold. "It is perfect up here in the shade," continued Felton, "and I am sorry to break up your tete-a-tete, but your sister sent me after you, and she wants you immediately. I told her I would send you back at once. You will find her up there by those turnips you spoke of." Harold Boylston rose reluctantly. "Suppose we all go up together to see those apples, Felton. Won't you come up, Miss Moore?" "No, I think I will cool off a little longer," said Delight, glancing mischievously at Felton, who had dropped into Boylston's seat. "And remember that your sister is waiting for you." Boylston strode off, leaving the field and the rustic bench in possession of his friend, who took no pains to conceal his pleasure. Mrs. Boylston and Miss Hollis saw him approach through the crowd. "Here we have been sitting alone on this board for a perfect age," they both cried. "What have you done with Mr. Felton? What did you send him after me for? Couldn't you do without me for a few minutes? Felton knows a sight more about pigs and turnips than I do. I did my part hunting up an interesting man for you, and it's not my fault if you can't hold on to him for 5 minutes. I couldn't very well chain him up for you. I didn't send him for you, Harold. I just said I wondered what had become of you." And off he rushed. "But I supposed, of course, he would come back." "I told you he wouldn't," put in her sister. "And now, Harold, please find the wagonette and drive us home. I am tired to death of animals and vegetables, and I think agricultural fairs are perfectly horrid. I have been once to see what they are like, and now that I know, I shall never come again." Harold found the horses without a word, and drove them home in solemn silence, Mrs. Boylston was most enthusiastic about the lovely view as they drove along, but he was only conscious that he had left Felton in possession of the rustic seat and the bewitching owner of the red bonnet. Felton had always spent his vacations with his uncle in Thornbridge, and he and Delight were old friends. This time he had only run down for 2 or 3 days, and Boylston learned with pleasure the following day that he had gone back to town. During the weeks which followed, Boylston became what Miss Elizabeth termed steady company. He and Delight were the best of friends, and as their vacation had begun, he had ample chance to indulge in ideal drives, walks, and talks. But the best of friends must part, and the brightest days will end, and Harold's good times were brought to a close by a telegram from his father, which announced that his immediate presence in town was both desirable and necessary. He had really forgotten during the last few weeks that there were such words as time or town. Now he suddenly realized how very pleasant it all had been, and how he should miss Miss Delight's dark eyes and enchanting smile. He tried to persuade himself, however, that it was all a fleeting summer episode. He should not think so much about Delight when he was once in town, and she would forget him, of course, very soon. Would she? This last thought did not give him the satisfaction that he had expected to derive from it. He decided to take the evening train up to the city, and in the afternoon he went up and bade Delight and Miss Elizabeth good-bye. Delight took his announcement with a calmness which did not please him as it should have done, and she was provokingly silent while Miss Elizabeth protested how much they should miss him. He had determined to leave in the highest of spirits, in which they were to share, but his efforts did not seem to be crowned with success, and his jokes failed to call forth any response from Delight's abstracted gaze. At last he rose to go. "I shall look for a continuation of my good times next summer, Miss Moore," he said, shaking hands with Delight. "Good-bye, Mr. Boylston. We shall always be glad to see you," she replied, quietly, steadily returning his searching look, and Boylston, lifting his hat, walked rapidly down through the long rows of hollyhocks, which he fancied closed behind him, shutting him out from all that was best and most beautiful. His sister was not going back to town until the following week. Having packed his valise and swallowed a hasty supper, he set out for the station, after refusing the lady's offer to drive him down to the train, as he hoped that the walk would make him feel better. By the time he reached the station, however, he felt much worse. If Delight had cared anything for him she would not have said good-bye so calmly. Would she forget him as soon as he had gone? He knew that he could not forget her for one moment, nor could he deceive himself longer on that score. He loved her, and always should love her, not less as time went on, but more and more. How unfeeling he had been to leave without a word. He deserved her utmost scorn. While he stood waiting for the down train, the train from the city came in, and he caught sight of Felton alighting with bag, fishing tackle, and tennis racket. He had come down for his vacation. "How do you do, Boylston?" he called out, cheerfully. "So you're off on the 8 o'clock train, are you?" Boylston's feelings underwent a sudden change. A wild jealousy took possession of him, and with it came a sudden determination. The 8 o'clock train was rapidly coming into sight. "I say, Felton," he cried, grasping him by the hand. "What is it?" demanded Felton. "Go up and spend the evening with my worthy relatives. I had to rush off quite suddenly, and I fancy that they are rather upset. I'll be everlastingly grateful if you'll go there tonight, Charlie." Felton hesitated. He had meant to stroll over to the moors, but he would have the field there to himself, now that Boylston had gone, so he promised, and departed. Harold entered the station, and deposited his bag in the waiting room. When he emerged upon the platform again, the last car of the down train was just disappearing from view. "Lost your train, Mr. Boylston?" queried the station master. "Yes," he replied, calmly. "There is nothing now till the midnight train, is there?" Delight was sitting on her favorite step, with her head resting among the honeysuckles. She had just returned from a walk to a neighbor's, where she and Miss Elizabeth had been invited to tea. She had pleaded a headache, and had come home, leaving her aunt to enjoy herself with the others. The moon was slowly rising above the hills, but Delight was quite unconscious of the fact. 2 large tears were rolling down her cheeks, as she sat there, silent and motionless. In her hand she held her red bonnet, which she had taken off. She looked at it, scornfully, and at last tossed it impatiently on to the step by her side, and buried her face in the honeysuckles. Can Aunt Lizzie have returned so soon? She must not find her crying. "Good evening, Miss Moore," said an unmistakable voice. "Why, Mr. Boylston, where did you come from?" she said, faintly, sinking back into the depths of the vines. "From the station, to be sure. I lost the 8 o'clock train, you see," he added, "so I thought I would come up and say good-bye over again." "Was the first good-bye so pleasant that you wanted a repetition?" she murmured. "No, it was not," he exclaimed, quite fiercely, sitting down on the step beside her. But he rose again, immediately. "What is this?" he cried, producing a much flattened object. "My bonnet," she responded, beginning to laugh. "Oh, I'm so sorry," he said, holding it up, and regarding it ruefully. "That lovely bonnet!" "It's no matter," laughed Delight, "for I had decided to indulge in a new one." Boylston still held it up mournfully. "There can never be another as pretty or as interesting. You may get a very beautiful one, but you can never have another bonnet like this. I shall never feel the same toward any other bonnet." "Delight," he cried, impetuously, "have you been crying? You were just a little sorry to have me go?" "I could not go until I had made sure of that. Dearest, I love you. Will you be my wife?" When Miss Elizabeth returned, later in the evening, she was more than astonished to find that the recently departed Boylston was not on his way to the city, and that Delight's headache was completely cured, and Felton, true to his word, spent a long and quiet evening with Mrs. Boylston and her sister, after assuring them that he had left Harold just boarding the 8 o'clock train. It was a great satisfaction to him to feel that his friend was safely back in town, and Harold Boylston thought kindly of Felton as he stepped aboard the midnight train. "I never appreciated, before," he said to himself, "what a first-rate fellow Felton is." End of section 6.